Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Warlick, the Vice President for Defense for FC International, and we're going to keep this program going. As you heard from General Wood earlier, it's going to be pretty fast-paced this afternoon. I think the format this afternoon will be very similar to what we heard the first thing, and I think you'll enjoy it. This afternoon's topic is threats and cross-agency incident response. It's going to be moderated by Mr. Rich Smith, Vice President for Cybersecurity at CACI. It's hard not to say khaki, really. But I know that's the appropriate way to go. Richard is the Vice President of Enterprise IT and Chief Technology Officer for the khaki, as I just mentioned, for CACI. He's responsible for a myriad of things. I'll just give you a couple. Homeland Security portfolio for service and development of an enterprise IT strategy for large multi-billion-dollar market cap organizations. He specializes in cybersecurity, software-defined networking, cloud integration, infrastructure, and hybrid IT services. It's hard to believe, but in his spare time, he's an adjunct professor for cybersecurity at the University of Maryland. Please join me in a warm welcome for this panel.
Thank you for that introduction, kind introduction. So I'm going to be the moderator for the panel here, this esteemed panel, and I'm going to do quick introductions for everyone up here. Again, the topic of the day is cyber threats and cross-agency incident response. So to my left is Mr. Charles Garzoni, and he's the current Director of Cyber Response at the FBI, and he's a former Air Force OSI Assistant Special Agent. And he's accomplished senior leader in the cyber domain to include areas in cybersecurity, investigations, analysis, attribution, engagement, and policy at the national level. And to his left, we have Mr. Chris Comiskey. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Comiskey Strategic Solutions, LLC, a firm that specializes in cybersecurity, homeland security, and management consulting. Mr. Comiskey has 25 years of government experience in senior positions at both the federal and state levels, and is an undersecretary for management at DHS, as a state CIO, and as a state senator. Welcome. And then we have Dr. Sam Lyles. He's the acting director of cyber division within the Office of Intel and Analysis at DHS. He has over 30 years working with information technology and security. He has a doctorate in information security from Purdue, and he's written extensively on the topic of cyber conflict incident response and digital forensics. And finally, we have Mr. Greg Toohill, and he's the president of Sixterra Federal Group. And he's a highly experienced leader, large, complex, diverse, and global operations. He's also a former U.S. CISO and Deputy Assistant Secretary for CS&C. He is also a retired Air Force General Officer, decorated combat leader, American diplomat, and senior executive. So welcome, panelists. So I wanted to take an opportunity briefly just to go over and set the context for some of the questions that we had that we've discussed with the panelists. And I wanted to sort of cover the gorilla in the room. We recently had an Equifax compromise, a large compromise, over 143 million records were hacked. This is the most sensitive information that you'd find within your organization, personally identifiable information. And just to set the context for what this means, it's nearly half of the American population. That's how many records that were compromised, and it's 100% of the workforce. One other fact about that particular compromise was that their stock, if you looked at it on Friday, it was sitting at about $142 a share. You look at it today, it's about $113 a share, so you do the quick math. That's about a 3.5 billion market capitalization loss in a day. So definitely some reputational issues that they need to deal with, some reputational impacts. And then finally, I did a quick research on this, but in 2016, in their annual report, can anyone guess if there's any mention of cyber in there? Guessed it, there isn't. There's no mention of cyber within their annual report. So I think we all need to be concerned about things of this nature proliferating. And then wanted to touch base really quickly on the executive order on cybersecurity. We're going to talk about this, but roughly 90 days after the executive order on May 11th was released on cybersecurity and modern IT modernization, we've got, in talking to some of my colleagues, some peers, some CISOs, we find some good stuff in there. It reinforces existing policy in the executive order, but it doesn't do much to move the bar. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the panel, and so just wanted to kind of whet everybody's appetite for that. And then finally, something also that is pertinent to the panel is misinformation by hackers and by nation states. So we've heard recently about Facebook identifying Russian actors posing as Americans, using their platform for advertising misinformation, essentially. They're advertising misinformation on the Facebook platform. So again, this is something that I think we should all be concerned with. And to tie it back to lessons learned in the government, if you look at the most recent Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, and the misinformation that was being spread as a result of that on social media platforms. And if you're FEMA or if you're an agency, how do you counteract that misinformation that's out there? And so I think that we all need to be aware, at least, of that threat. So now I'm going to jump into the questions after we've kind of got everybody on the same page here. So I want to ask about a different breach, and I'm going to start with Chris here. And so another significant breach that we had was the Opm Data Breach, and I wanted to ask you how you worked together in response to the Opm Data Breach, and specifically around information sharing with that breach.
Great. Well, thank you, Rich, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be on a panel with such an esteemed group of cyber experts. These folks around me really know their stuff, but let me take a shot at sort of what we were looking at in the months leading up to the OPM breach, and particularly looking at the forerunner to that, the USIS breach, which was about a 2-year window before the OPM breach actually broke free onto the landscape. And what we found was that the interconnectivity or the linkage between private sector vendors and the government systems is very much intertwined, as most of you in the room are very well aware of. And what we were able to discern was that the advanced persistent threat had been on that network for years, basically packing up this data, preparing it, and then exfiltrating it at times that were appropriate for the adversary. And so the understanding that the advanced persistent threat is ongoing and pervasive was something that really started to come to the forefront as part of that USIS breach. And as with Equifax, we're seeing that impacts how those companies do their jobs. USIS basically went out of business. It was the largest vendor to OPM at the time for the SF-86 background investigation work. And so it really became a preparation ground for what we would see next in OPM. The second part of that is legacy system replacement. There's a lot of talk now about IT modernization, which the panelists will talk about, but it's harder to do that than actually talk about it. And when you look at the legacy systems across the federal enterprise, you see this unevenness, and OPM was an example of that. Not having dual factor authentication, weak encryption, all the things that the congressional investigation found when they issued their report last year. And so it's going to take time to come out of that. But I think if we start with the concentric circle of what is the most important data, General Toohill used to pound that point home when he was at DHS. Let's look at the data sets. Let's make sure that those that are most sensitive and high sensitivity are protected first and work your way out from there. And so that's something I think that NPPD at DHS has done a pretty good job of. And lastly, I think it's the training. I think that the workforce and the federal government, we all know, is going to need additional skill sets. Mike Papay from Northrop served on the Cyber Skills Task Force at DHS. They came back with a series of recommendations that made a lot of sense, but it takes time to implement those things, using the authorities that you're given in terms of hiring, trying to equalize as much as you can on pay with the private sector, and making it an exciting place to work. I know the FBI is much more exciting than some of the stops along the way at DHS, but trying to show, have people come and work at DHS, particularly in the end kicker, US Cert for a couple of years before moving on, is really a good proving ground. And I hope that that's what we've learned as part of the OPM breach.
Thank you, Chris. Any other?
Yeah, I'll pile on to
Yeah,
that.
go ahead, Greg.
You know, frankly, I think from an information sharing standpoint, there's a whole lot more information sharing been going on over the last 5, 10 years. But part of the problem is you can be sharing all day long, but if people aren't listening and if they're not acting on that information, bad things can happen. And as Chris mentioned, we've been trying to get folks to realize that cybersecurity is not a technology issue, it's really a risk management issue. And at the heart of it, it's all about the information that you're trying to protect. And understanding what information you have, where it is, and what the risks are to that information really should be at the center of your program. And unfortunately, we've been trying to defend information equally, regardless of its value. And with regard to the OPM breach, it's a perfect case of folks that may not have been listening to the warning cries that have been put out there. Direction had been put in place for multi-factor authentication, and it's not just OPM, but in a lot of places where it wasn't done for just general user accounts, let alone privileged user accounts. So, it's important to share information, but it's, in my view, it's equally important to put a punctuation point and emphasis on acting upon the information that's being shared so that you can, in fact, implement what I call proportionate defense. I don't want to spend $10 protecting 2 cents worth of information. I want to make sure that I am aligning my defenses in a manner that's going to deliver efficient and effective solutions that are going to provide greater security. So as we take a look forward, information sharing is great, but we also need to make sure that we have execution and follow through.
Thank you. Dr. Lyles?
So I was going to say, at the time when OPM breach occurred, I was a CISO to a major military command. And as a CISO, it doesn't make much sense now because everybody's kind of got a good idea what happened. But at that time, we were trying to wonder, was the OPM breach a privacy event with PII being exposed and not a problem within our network? Or was it a security event, which means the CISO would run it? And that kind of coordination at the command level had to occur. So as CISO, I didn't care. I declared an event, which caught my commanders by surprise. And they were like, why would you do that? I said, because regardless of the agent or effect of the OPM breach, all that PI is out there, and it became an issue of how could it be used against our network, because all of this information was in the wild. So they got that at one point. The second thing it did was, by getting the privacy officer on board, we were able to coordinate a PI policy, and we were far ahead of Department of Army as far as doing that, because we'd already thought it through and we'd been using our event and logistics for having done an incident. Flash forward to I move into DHS in the intel world. I'm not a career intelligence officer, I'm a career cyber guy. And I'm working on the back end after everything, and we see that, it's OPM, but it's all the other agencies that supplied services to OPM. It's all the coordination trying to get the evidence out of those agencies. It's all of the things trying to come into how the customer data was used or how our data was used and where that data may be found. And what was going on with the systems as we were putting more data into those, trying to continue to the operations of government and what would happen with that data. And that showed me that the sharing environment was getting much broader. In the intel world, the other thing was CTIC was created out of that, which brought all the intel organizations together to be able to share and coordinate the data that the intel world was seeing. So there was a lot of really positives that came out of that exist now that never had been before.
So Charlie, you want to?
Yeah, so OPM was actually my crash course to this position as the incident response director. That was sort of our first major incident where we were right in the middle of trying to sort of revamp our incident response process and how we coordinate with the community, how we coordinate with each other. So that was really, so as we were sort of writing PPD 41 and then following it up with the NSERC, we were actually starting to engage some of those processes as if those documents existed while we were framing them. So we got a chance to test out some of those processes, and it actually worked well for us. we were able to communicate much more efficiently than we had in the past. So OPM was actually, I think, for the government, a great wake-up call / learning experience, and how to move forward. But it did show us where we were woefully inadequate. And I hope Greg will tell me frequently how woefully inadequate I am. But honestly, for us, it was, okay, this Sony was really, for the FBI, Sony was the wake-up call. Sony was sort of the first incident where cyber bled over into the kinetic realm. And the thing that, for us, we weren't really prepared for that. In fact, some of the employees at Sony were receiving threats to the schools that their children went to. So that threat was sort of multifaceted. And I don't think we or other people were prepared for that. We actually, at our field office, we have victim witness assistance specialists that we had to stop and go, okay, we need to enact some of our regular processes over and bring them over into cyber because we're seeing a bleed over. So from Sony to OPM, for us, great learning experiences and showing us where we definitely need to do better, where we need to communicate more, get threat intel out faster. And everyone says move at the speed of cyber, and the government doesn't always do that, obviously. But figure out how do we get to that speed a little bit faster.
Thanks. And that's actually a good segue into the next question, Charlie. In your crash course, as you call it, with OPM and with later on with Sony, did you utilize cloud to enhance your collaboration and information sharing with other entities, state, local, federal?
So, great question, and I think for us the answer is no. At the time we didn't utilize those resources, but realized that we needed to start. And I'll just speak for the FBI. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but on the unclassified side, our resources were almost non-existent before then. We had email, and that's it. And we had a phone to be able to check email. That's it. We didn't have storage space on the unclassified side. Being able to collaborate on the unclassified side was just phone calls. And we realized that we really need to start using collaborative tools that are out in the wild. The FBI likes to write their own, and of course they're horrible. So we started looking at like Slack and Microsoft Teamspace that a lot of agencies in the government already have. It's how do we connect those? How do we communicate? We were talking about that earlier. How do we connect those and communicate with each other? And we're just starting to go down that path of being able to use cloud infrastructures and the services that use cloud infrastructures to communicate and coordinate effectively across the width and breadth of incidents as they happen, especially the significant ones like OPM and Sony.
Great. Any follow-ons to that, Greg?
Up to you. You want to go, Sam, and then I'll pile on.
Yes, sir. So I say, in the IC, we've got the IC IT environment, the intelligence community IT environment, allows us to do a lot of the cloud things. And there's a lot of people can go read about a lot of the things that have gone on with that. And within DHS, we have something also called data framework, allows us to move data sets around and do a lot of really, really cool things. But we haven't leveraged that as well as we could within the idea of technical incident response. But we're getting to the point where our data sets now are beginning to morph into the ability to do transactions across the cloud. Unfortunately, on the unclassified side, we've got the cloud environments that we interact with, but there's like these pillars of cloud where they don't actually talk to each other. So it's great that you're on the cloud, but then we haven't got a lot of the things we really need out of them. And what that leads us to do is when we're looking at our idea of collecting information, DHS INA, we do overt collection. So everybody that's ever had anything go wrong that we've reported on knew it because they gave the data to us. And what we do is we do that kind of stuff. Taking that data in now is becoming more of an automated process and allowing us to do this. So if stuff comes in from the unclass, immediately goes up to our classified space. At some point in time, we'll be able to do that all in the unclassified space, and it'll do it a lot more effective, and that allows us to work with the FBI, with the NCIC, with everybody else much easier. And that's where we want to get.
Okay, I'll play the contrarian here. I think we stink, but we don't stink as bad as we had in the past. Frankly, with my background, having spent time doing incident response in .mil, then .gov, .com, .edu, you name the different ones that my teams and I have been involved in during my career. Everybody seems to be in a sense of denial everywhere you go, and everybody's special. I think in our society today, everybody's got to get a trophy, so everybody thinks they're really special. Everybody's really special because you're all a victim at one point or another. So when it comes to sharing information, I think we've done a lot better job, but we still stink. There's an overclassification of information. Everything that comes out of the fort is classified TSSCI, and oh, by the way, if it comes out of the fort, and when I was Yankick director before John, one of our colleagues did a quick little study, did 1,000 indicators, just a sample of 1,000 indicators, and said, let's take a look and see how fast it takes for us to find it on the internet in open source. And guess what the average was? It was about seven days. It's going to be out on the internet anyway, TSSCI stuff. So why does it take longer to declassify stuff than it does to, it just takes too dang long. I think we really need to relook on how we classify information so that we can share it faster, so we can get things out as a heads up and lead turn the problem as opposed to react to it. And as I take a look at the future of information sharing, yeah, automated indicator sharing is important, and the ISACs are critical, and having that cyber neighborhood watch is essential, and being an active participant in information sharing. But we can't overclassify. Otherwise, we have the cones of silence and nothing gets done.
Take that, Chris.
I would just add one point that I think the panelists are absolutely correct. At DHS, there were 50 data centers when we got there in 2009, some of us, and they said we're going to get to 5. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So we got it down in the 20s, which was a pretty good effort overall. But I think in cloud, it won't make much difference if we just do the same thing with cloud that we did with the data centers, and that there are these stovepipes all over the landscape, and everyone's got their private cloud, and they're working with the vendors, but it's not shareable in any sense or their fashion. I think the good doctor and Donna Roy in the information sharing environment have not received the resources that they need to make this thing fly, because they have the right idea. They've got the mechanism to do it there between INA and CIO and PPD to share a lot of good information with FBI and other external partners. But until the budget process recognizes that, and it was hard to get the front office to buy into that, because they're like, what are we doing with these? We don't even understand the names that you're calling these things. And so the money wouldn't get behind it. Until we start doing that, it's really going to continue to just kind of wobble along without the kind of results I think we're looking for.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Chris mentioned the data centers and some of the challenges, the budget challenges in this current environment that we have. Dr. Lyle, can you talk to us a little bit about how agencies are interpreting and responding to the Cyber EO, which talks about IT modernization and things that basically are not budgeted, they're not budgeted currently?
So one of the things about the Cyber EO, it's interesting, especially from the IC perspective, is it's a series of reports along with some directives. And so there's two elements. There's Cybersecurity EO, then you have the IT modernization EO, and these two kind of go hand in hand. And so the Cybersecurity EO is interesting because there's lots of things that were leaked to the press about it early on. It was a very different EO that came out finally than people were expecting. Mm-hmm. But it actually made a lot of sense because it basically was instantiating a lot of things we've always said. You got to do sharing, you got to do all the stuff for how are you doing sharing, what's the number of people you're sharing with, what is the effect of that. That's pretty good. How are agencies doing their security elements and things like that. Our piece within the IC was to talk about the threat, right? And to explain to everybody what the threat is. I came up with a talking point early on, which was, it doesn't really do me any good to tell you a TSSCI indicator if you've not patched for the basic vulnerability. And so the EO actually talks about doing that. I think a lot of the agencies are getting a better handle on that. Mm-hmm. We deal with all 320 some odd agencies and sub-agencies within my organization. So we talk to a lot of people about what they're doing and where they're trying to go. And I see that as a positive piece because EO brings that to the forefront. It's what every good CIO and CISO wants to do anyway, but now they've got some horsepower behind them to say they do it. As far as the IT modernization, I think we're going to talk a little more about that, but it actually, I think it's being leveraged as the second piece to that, which is to help them get their systems back and running.
Any follow-ons to that?
Yeah, I'll pile on.
Great.
You know, as we take a look at the executive order, and this may shortcut the last question you had said,
Right.
you know, were there any real surprises in it for anybody? Anybody raise a hand if they saw a surprise in there? Because I didn't see any surprises. Frankly, it was good common sense and built on a lot of the stuff that was going on in the Bush administration and the Obama administrations and like. I kind of liked where we were going with the EO that came out in May. But, you know, we really have to follow through. And I'm one of those guys who says, hey, we've already got some pretty good policies, but we're just not executing them well. So let's not try to go get some new policies until we execute the ones we have really well. And as we take a look at, you know, the cyber EO and the budget, and there's a huge budget constraints. Well, let's look at the bottom line. How much money are we spending? We're spending lots and lots and lots of money. I think we've got plenty of money budgeted in the budget, but we're not spending it well. And one of the things that I think is hamstringing us is the fact that we've got a 1980s architecture that we keep on following the road to Abilene and trying to put another coat of asphalt and hot patch on it. It's time that we go out there and get a 21st century architecture that's built on cloud computing, get a really good secure front end, and let's execute well. And I think we're going to find that we have plenty of money to do what's really important. We just really need to buckle the chin straps and do the right things the right way and follow 21st century architectures and best practices as opposed to following a 1980s org chart style network construct.
Charlie, Chris, and
So when it comes to IT modernization, if some organizations are in the Stone Ages, the FBI is in the Ice Ages. And I think that one thing that we look at when we talk about IT modernization is, and I hope that the rest of the government starts doing this as well, is don't try to do everything yourself. Stop trying to reinvent the tools that already exist in the commercial sector that are going to be 10 times better at it than the government is. And we have organizations in the FBI that do research and development and develop tools. And I hope that we gear that more towards the classified space and the spy versus spy stuff, and leave the collaboration and open engagement processes to the civilian sector. My hope for the government is that we start utilizing some of those commercial services that are much better at it than we are, and much more looked up to for those same reasons.
I just want to make one point. You got to fill these jobs. I mean, if you're going to advance an agenda, you've got to have a federal CIO. You have to have Greg's replacement. You've got to have an undersecretary at MPPD that's going to run this stuff, and you have to deconflict the EOs. We've got EO fatigue. You've got the Office of American Innovation, Arizona American Technology Council. You've got multiple EOs on the subject that Dr. Lilly's talked about, making sure that you're deconflicting that and it finds its way into the 19 budget build. Otherwise, we're just talking about IT modernization in a vacuum and waiting for legislation to pass in Congress that we haven't funded. So I'm hoping that the pieces of the puzzle start to coalesce in a way where we can actually get some traction.
okay. So with this EO fatigue, as we'll call it, do we see how do we perceive the next generation of cyber threats, and how are we preparing to address those? And I'm talking specifically about some of the most difficult threats out there, health IT, threats against health IT. We recently saw WannaCry and the attacks against the health systems, against critical infrastructure. Charlie, you want to take a crack at that?
So, sort of as we look at threats in general, we see that typically adversaries are going to do things the way that those adversaries know how to do them. When you look at tactics, techniques, and procedures, and how each threat group operates, whether it's a criminal enterprise or a nation state, they go with what they know, typically. So they actually tend to evolve a little bit faster than we do, obviously, and we have to play catch up a little bit. I think with some of the operations that we've conducted and some of the investigations that were government-wide investigations and operations, we've been able to mold the adversary a little bit into kind of where we want them, spaces that we wanted them to go. That's on a micro scale, though, not on a macro scale. If you look at the way adversaries operate and behave, you have to go back to the country's ideology to figure out how they're going to interact. Obviously, Russia behaves very differently from China and very differently from other countries, but from all the operations and investigations that we've conducted and indictments against the PLA officers from way back when, of all the operations that we conducted during that time, what we didn't realize was the most effective tool was actually shaming the adversary. But that was because China takes that very seriously. They don't like to be publicly called out. So that was actually the most effective thing that we did, is say, hey, we know you did this, and started seeing a change in behavior. But as we look to the future and how adversaries that are on the cutting edge of technological attacks, we're starting to see it's not any different than it was before. They have to come up with a new way of doing something as we figure out a way to defend it. They have to come up with a new way to attack us, and it's very easy to do that, right? They're never running out of tools to attack us with. Because again, if you're not patching that vulnerability that's been out for 6 months, they don't have to go into a highly advanced toolbox. They're just going to exploit that vulnerability, or they're going to spearfish you because they're going to hit the human element because they know you're going to click on that email. And honestly, I've seen some actors that have targeted myself and others where I almost clicked on it. And when you get an email from one of your own analysts, you're, should I click it? Wait a minute. And you have to stop and think, right? So the way that adversaries are behaving now is very much personal. So the intel component behind those adversaries is astronomical. The resources that they have, I mean, they're making some of these spearfishes look so authentic that they probably got a 30% chance of hitting any one of us, and we do this for a living, right? But realize when they start utilizing other components like penetrating a cloud environment, but then trying to be part of that cloud environment, that's where I think we're going to start seeing a lot of the adversaries behave. They know how to behave in a network construct, and I think they're just starting to figure out how to behave in a cloud environment construct, how to hide, and how to remain undetected. So I know that the Russians, we talked about misinformation, but the Russians they're very good at denial and deception. And, other governments and countries are great at providing their own misinformation intentionally, but that's always been in the adversary's toolbox. Just go to World War II, where they were doing that. Of course, it's much less technical in nature, but not utilizing social media. But the effects of those misinformation, denial, and deception, the way that adversaries are going to operate now, the effect is instantaneous. Even if you look at the elections, the effect of how some of these folks behave is instantaneous compared to World War II.
Mm-hmm. Greg, you want to pick that up?
When I'm teaching at Carnegie Mellon, I talk with my students that at any given time there's probably about 300 to 400 active cyber entities that are out there playing malicious tag with folks. And if you go and you bin them, there's really 6 main threats that you got to prepare for. You got the burglars that are financially motivated, the folks who are going to be crooks trying to steal money. You got the vandals who are going to be politically motivated usually. Those are the guys who are going to go try to promote a certain message. They're going to spray paint your website, all that type of stuff. They're going to try to impugn your reputation. You got the muggers that are out there, and that could be, like the folks who went after Sony, or the cyber bullies that are, picking on your high school kid. They're out there. You've got spies. They could be internal spies. They could be external spies. They could be trying to be political, military, or intellectual property theft. There's all sorts of spies that are out there. You also have to watch out for saboteurs. Those are pretty nasty type of threats, because you don't want something to happen to critical infrastructure, for example, through sabotage or the like. But I'll tell you, in all the different incident responses, still over 95% are caused by careless, negligent, and indifferent people. And you just got to plan for stupid sometimes. But that threat environment is not going to change by the categories. It's going to change by the tools and the targets. And I'll tell you, the tools are changing all the time. But I think as you take a look into the crystal ball, we've already had a lot of attacks that went after availability, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability model of cybersecurity. So availability is under attack all the time with DDoS and other things. We've already seen a lot of attacks on confidentiality. Opm is probably one of the bellwether ones. Equifax has now joined that litany on confidentiality. I'm really concerned that the next big one is going to be an attack on integrity. And how much are you going to be willing to pay if you're in, let's say, corporate America? If somebody comes in and demonstrates that they've gone in and tampered with your information, and then further, they've gone back into your backups, they've been patient, and they've waited for you to back up the tampered information. Then they come to you and they say, ransomware, all that WannaCry stuff, that was kids' play. Now you really got to pay billions of dollars or millions of dollars to get your integrity back. So I think, as we take a look at the future, the binning is probably going to stay pretty much the same as far as the threat environment you got to plan for, but you still need to get to protecting your information against changing tactics, techniques, and procedures, the different tools, and the like. And I'm really concerned the next big attack is going to be towards integrity.
Any quick responses?
So I'll be quick. So I always say that it'll always be spearfishing, whaling, and water hauling. Those will be the three things that people will use because they work. Because you're not interested in patching vulnerabilities, they'll continue to work. In the Equifax we're talking about, I think it was 2014, the NKIC through the US CERT actually put out a vulnerability statement on Struts. The thing that was used in Equifax has been tied to the exploit. So it wasn't unknown, and inside the hacker community, they've been talking about the Struts vulnerabilities for almost a decade. So it's not an unknown problem or issue for that to happen. And so that's what the adversaries continue to use. But at the same time, 2011, we saw, I think it was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that was hit with an attack against their thermostats, and people are surprised that IoT is now becoming an issue, and Internet of Things becoming an issue. The idea of using those things as pivot points into networks because they're not controlled, they're not considered in part of the artifice of how we do our security programs. So there's all this stuff going on. People aren't considered the car. 2014, I think it was the Opm Cavalry group hosted a thing out of DEF CON where we talked about hacking cars and talked extensively about that. That ended up creating the automotive ISAC. That was the final thing that came out of that. Of course, Charlie Miller being on TV, hacking a Ford Focus or Ford Fusion, whatever it was, that probably had a little bit to do with it. So those kind of threats are starting to morph. Look at the technology stack, think about the things that are coming forward, and think about whether or not they're controlled items, patched items, or commodities, hardware, software items, and those are where we're seeing a lot of the attack streams coming in.
Thanks. Any follow-up? No. Well, that concludes our panel. I think we're going to open it up for a short Q&A. Do we have a short Q&A?
We can set up Q&A though after the panel breaks.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for this esteemed panel. Thank you very much, and thank you, audience. Sorry, I didn't know.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mike Warlick again. I'd just like to say that may be the best presentation I've heard on threats and incidents anywhere. Panel, fantastic job. Another great hand for them, please. As they walk off the stage, I want to remind everyone that FC will make a donation to the FCA Disaster Relief Fund on behalf of the panel members today. If you have questions, and I'm sure some of you do have questions for the panelists just leaving the stage, we ask that you meet them outside the concourse speaker contact area, just right outside. Now we'll ask our next panel to come to the stage, and we'll get started momentarily. Thank you for your cooperation. That email like you did.
Definitely not for you. Hi. Do you want to dance here? It's here. Oh, yeah. What's the season of the bowling? You got dances and all over the place? No, I'm talking about the kids. Oh, no sports right now? Really?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin here momentarily. I'd ask you to please move towards your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I would remind you that we have not only those here in the audience, but we're filming this and it'll be up on our AFCEA event website. We're very glad we have the ability to present this information. This is the third of 4 panels on a variety of cyber activities. The next one will be on the international aspects of cyber and cybersecurity. We are very happy to have as our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Mike Pepe is Chief Information Security Officer for Northrop Grumman. He is more than that, as a CISO, and he oversees Northrop Grumman's global computer and network information security systems. He directs the corporate cyber strategy as Vice President of Cyber Initiatives as well, and works across the enterprise in advocating for cyber and cybersecurity workforce issues. 27 years with Northrop Grumman, a variety of engineering solutions are to his credit, in a variety of everything from missile defense to command and control, network security, ISR, and platforms. I find it interesting, he's a recognized expert in modeling and simulation and has served on a variety of advisory groups and panels and has worked with universities, GMU, George Washington, Cal Poly, in the area of modeling and simulation. So an expert in the engineering, science, modeling and simulation, cybersecurity and strategy. I think it's a great opportunity we have for Mike to chair this panel and allow us to understand the issues as described by the panelists. We have a distinguished panel. I'll allow introductions to proceed as we go along. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the panel to the stage.
Thanks, sir. So I've got a great panel today, and I'm glad those of you that stuck around are going to get to hear some of the leading experts. One of the things we're going to talk about today is roles and responsibilities in cyber. And as I go down the line, I think you're going to see that a lot of these people have had multiple roles in a variety of government, academia, industry, and so they're ideally suited to be talking about this topic. So I've got a few questions. I hope you guys are saving up some questions as well. This is not a shy panel. This is, you guys are going to have to probably jump up and down and say, I've got a question before you guys are done. This is a great panel. So let me go down the line here real quick and introduce everybody. Right to my left is Frank Salufo.
I'm rarely to your left.
I said, what did I say?
To your left. I said I'm rarely.
You are rarely to my left. That is true. So Frank is the Associate Vice President and Director in the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at George Washington University, although he has held multiple roles in the past as Director of the Homeland Security Advisory Council at the White House. He's been in and out of government. He's frequently called upon to testify in front of Congress. I do it like once every couple of years, and Frank gives me advice. To Frank's left is Phyllis Schneck. Dr. Schneck is the Managing Director and Global Leader of Cyber Solutions for Promontory. And Phyllis says here has 15 years of government and private sector experience. I didn't realize that you'd been around that long. I thought you were younger than that. So Phyllis was the Deputy Undersecretary for the DHS and MPPD, and was also the CTO of McAfee. Phyllis and I have worked a lot together, and I'm happy to be back on the Phyllis Schneck groupie tour, which I think in 2015 we found each other on the same panel or same dais about every other week. So but thanks for coming today. Appreciate it. Phil Reitinger is next. Phil is the President and CEO of the Global Cyber Alliance, a nonprofit organization focused on eradicating systemic cybersecurity risks. However, Phil is also the former Deputy Undersecretary at DHS and the NPPD, and so I think they have like a little pinky shake or something like that where they share with each other. Phil and I have known each other for a while too. He's been in and out of industry as well. Glad to see you're back in a leadership role where you can help drive some solutions. It's very critical that we get people with government experience who know how these solutions can get rolled out. So thanks for coming, Phil. Kathy Kraninger is last but not least, Program Associate Director for General Government at the Office of Management and Budget, but has also held very senior roles in the past for the U.S. Senate on appropriations, as well as on the House of Representatives for appropriations and Subcommittee on Cybersecurity. So, law degree from Georgetown. How many lawyers do we have up here? A couple? Oh, geez. So it's me, a rocket scientist, and a bunch of lawyers, and a doctor in computer science. So this ought to be a lot of fun. So let's start off with talking a little bit about roles and responsibilities in cyber. It's a muddy field out there, and it's hard to get any traction when you're trying to figure out how to make progress in cyber. So my first question for the group, is there a clear established framework among federal agencies and industry in responding to national or global cyber incidents? And I think everybody knows the answer to this, but Phyllis was hitting me up in the hallway. She said, I want to answer first. I want. So go ahead, you go first.
So first of all, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you Mike and to the panel for setting this up. What we talked about in the hallway was that I said, would it be okay if I admitted that there is no framework? And likely there wouldn't be. I feel like my future, my past, and cybersecurity has stayed the same. And a lot of what we saw in the government, and I'll look to the others to add to this or challenge this, is that when something happened, whether it was in the private sector or the government, everybody, if it was in the government, every agency responded their own way. But at DHS, we coordinated that through our National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. I can still pronounce that, the NCIC. And that reached out to all the other agencies. But if you needed a full government coordinated response, that took a committee of all the deputies of all the agencies to either do a lot of email or to meet in the White House. And so there isn't a very fast, coherent game book, and it's not clear that there ever would be because of all the complexity. In the private sector, yes, private companies are very good at responding to this, but what I think I've seen on both sides is there's no push up front to be resilient. It's very, very reactive still, and my personal opinion is that cybersecurity is not about preventing anything. It's not about building higher walls. It's really about how do you come out on top when you have an intrusion, because you will have an intrusion, and that's for certain. This is not going to change. The way we change the game of cybersecurity is to focus on the resilience, and I don't think there's a given framework, either in government or private sector, for that.
So Kathy, Phil, maybe you could talk about the things that work right in the government and industry collaboration and coordination framework.
So I just, on the response side, at least if it hasn't been withdrawn yet, PPD 41 is the defined set of roles and responsibilities. And so I can say this since I wasn't in government at the time, I think it gets it mostly right. As Phyllis said, it's not a checklist of, in this event, X does this, Y does this. It's a high-level assignment of roles and responsibilities with different responsibilities given to DHS, the intelligence community, or the ODNI, I should say, and the Department of Justice. And I think it gets it pretty much right. The only criticism I think I had at the time is that it doesn't really define who leads the subsidiary level group. That's not the NCRCG, it's the UCG. There are a lot of acronyms in it, and I don't read it enough to know fully what those are. But it's a pretty good set of roles and responsibilities that I would certainly advise no new administration, since we have a new administration, to reconsider, because it's one of those sort of fairly straightforward things that I think ought to happen. In terms of the other spaces of roles and responsibilities, there's probably some further definition that needs to take place. I'm particularly interested in, and Phyllis knows about this as well, what the long-term set of roles and responsibilities are for providing a more secure and responsive infrastructure to prevent events. I agree very much with Phyllis that you will have an intrusion, so resilience and response are very important. I'd actually think prevention is still really important to me. Maybe that's because I'm involved in an organization that focuses a lot on prevention, and where you stand depends on where you sit. But we need to build out the right mechanisms so that we've got, Chris Inglis used to say that you need two things to be effective in this space. You need infrastructures that are defendable, that are adequately defended. And we can adequately defend infrastructures that are defendable, but outside of the collection of a few people in this room and maybe some major banks, mostly infrastructures are not defendable right now, which is what leads to the situation that Phyllis was talking about.
I guess I can offer, for those of you who don't know probably why I am up here, I'm at the Office of Management and Budget, and one of the 5 paths who basically split the federal budget. So I have six cabinet level agencies and a myriad of independent agencies, and that also includes GSA, DHS, NIST, and Commerce. So the one thing that I would tell you from, and then just serving as an executive within the Office of Management and Budget, we certainly have the authorities of the regulatory arena and OIRA. We have what has become a much larger management organization as well that has the federal CIO position in it, has a federal procurement officer in it. So in terms of looking holistically at what is the government doing in this arena and how much does it cost, that's certainly the angle at which I come at this. And I do think the roles and responsibilities go along with resources. And so that is where, certainly where we sit, we'd like to be making sure that is a clearer road. I mean, I think to Phyllis's point, it is hard in this world because it is highly complex. There are a lot of responsibilities that have been given to different agencies over the years, and how exactly you unravel that and whether you need to is really, I think, a key question. But how you make sure that everyone is aware of what everyone else's responsibilities are and what they're doing is an ongoing iterative process. And I think there have been a lot of things established over the years to try to improve that, and we are continuing to do that. Certainly had an executive order that the president issued where we're looking at not just cybersecurity in some vacuum that you really, frankly, doesn't exist, but thinking about how that fits in with IT modernization. I mean, to the Phil's point about having systems that are actually defendable, we recognize that there is a massive antiquated infrastructure that is out there on the federal side, certainly how we interact with the private sector and move out. So thinking about this smartly. Again, I have the budget hat in the government, so I'm not going to be bringing a whole bunch of new money to this problem, but I think there are opportunities absolutely to be looking at efficiencies and reorganization. So that's the other executive order that the president issued that is under the purview of the Office of Management and Budget, is looking at government efficiency, is looking at possibilities for reorganization and streamlining. And you know, there are a lot of big ideas that are being put on the table, and there are a lot of small things you're going to see in the FY19 budget, a few that were in the 18 budget, to try to think this through and again figure out where there are opportunities to really focus this and put the resources and responsibilities into some clearer context. We definitely want to do that. And where there need to be better relationships and better awareness, we're certainly pushing for that as well.
Just to pick up on a couple of points, and I think the panel laid it out really well. I mean, the bottom line is we've got a lot of nouns we more or less know from a theoretical perspective through various presidential decision directives how to respond, but it all comes down to practice and implementation and execution. And one of the dilemmas with cyber is being able to discern what does demand the deputy's attention, what does demand the principal's attention, and often you don't know at the initial time of a breach. So when you have a kinetic incident, it's pretty clear how the sit room comes together, what the domestic or the foreign terrorism response would be. When it comes to cyber, we think we know it. We think we'll know it when we see it, but the reality is we've got a lot of intent, and I would argue it's still to one extent or another, not because of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it, but it's still aspirational more than it is tangibly operational. And part of that, to me, comes down to the fact that not all hacks are the same, not all hackers are the same, not all targets are the same, not all intentions are the same, and not all capabilities are the same. And then to add to the to some of the challenges, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily always healthy to look at it through a cyber lens alone. While cyber is its own domain, it does transcend air, land, sea, space. So if you were to respond to a physical sort of event, are you ensuring that the cyber issues are getting the prioritization they deserve, or will they get short shrift? So a long-winded way of saying, I think that triggers escalation. What does that look like? I think CTIC, the creation of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, is going to help with putting together that situational awareness to know what matters when it really matters. But I think right now, I think everyone has done a pretty good job on the policy side, but operations and execution is the name of the game, and I think we've got a ways to go there.
So actually, Frank, that's a great lead into the follow-up question which I had, which was, when you're trying to determine what these roles and responsibilities are across industry and government, how do you balance that need for sort of interconnected and coordinated responses with the fact that everybody's got this diversification of risk and responsibility? It's a and you brought it up just now, it's not all about cyber. So maybe from your background in Homeland Security and the initial days of DHS, can you talk a little bit about how that discussion went? Was there, you don't want it to get down to finger pointing, but you also want it to be collaborative enough that you can act with speed. It's tough, right?
Yeah, you know, actually some finger pointing I think is actually constructive, as long as it's everyone's focused on the same target, the same objectives, and the same goals. It just shouldn't play out in the newspapers, it should play out in the sit room. To me, that is actually something we shouldn't shy away from. But when you look at where we were from a counterterrorism or homeland security perspective, there were a number of presidential decision directors prior to 9/11, PDD 42, 43, 39, all of which appreciated the crisis management and the consequence management, as we used to refer to them now. Now I think Phyllis is spot on. It's really all about resilience. But when 9/11 was occurring, and you would bring the interagency together, we were literally struggling with terminology. So I'll never forget, without getting into any details, because I certainly don't, I've never had an unspoken thought, but I will never compromise anything I'm not supposed to talk about. The word, this was after a biocrimes incident in October of 2001, and the word surveillance was bandied around. And to the FBI, it was literally surveilling a target. To the DoD entities that were in the room, it was C4ISR. To the HHS folks, since it was a public health related issue, it was epidemiological surveillance. So just one term had very different meanings and outcomes to the various agencies that had to be part of. So we had a translational issue early on. I think now we've moved beyond that with respect to cyber. I do think it's certainly front of mind of decision makers. I think clearly there are a lot of people aware that it matters. But when it comes to an operational set of entities, is cyber so unique, and in some cases it will be, that you have to have a whole different decision, crisis management making chain? But in other cases, when we're looking at a physical set of issues, just look at Pyongyang right now. We can't look at North Korea. We can't look at cyber without understanding North Korea intentions and capabilities, and vice versa. We can't look at the threat without understanding, in addition to obviously their nuclear aspirations and capabilities, we have to understand what other tools they can bring to the fight. The reality is the government is not structured that way. And I hate to say it, the solutions aren't even going to be in the government. So the private sector really has to get a front seat at the table. So long-winded way of saying I think we kind of are getting there, but we're not there yet.
So Phil, maybe you guys talk a little bit about what you've seen in the years that span your NPPD experience, and that maybe how it's changed over time from figuring out whose role it is. Maybe I think, Phyllis, when you were there, a little more of DHS stepping up and saying, here's our role, we're in charge of this now, and maybe, Phil, maybe not so much when you were there, but you sort of made it your role. So if you guys could talk a little bit about that.
Can I go in order?
Go ahead. I think on occasion there's more focus on, this sounds weird to say it, but there's maybe sometimes too much focus on roles and responsibilities and not enough on capabilities. When it comes down to it, at the end of the day, people are going to listen to people who can share information or get things done. And early on in DHS, there was a shortage of capability that had to be developed. Apropos of some of the things that Kathy was talking about before, Jim Lewis likes to say that there are three sources of authority or capability, if you will, in government. Budget, authorities, and access to the president. And that really, I've thought about that for years, and that's pretty much true. Access to the president kind of trumps everything else. But like on authorities, access to the president, the Secretary of Homeland Security never had the access to the president that the Secretary of Defense did, for example, at least a while ago. Maybe that's changed. Authorities, early on, the authorities of DHS were essentially to coordinate. And if there was a problem, DHS could coordinate the heck out of it. But if you wanted them to actually get something done, it required a lot of collaboration, required a lot of trust building, And that was still a work in progress. Resources, DHS's resources, thanks to the great work Phyllis and Kathy's predecessors have done, its resources have grown substantially. But it's still rounding error compared to what you see in investment in cyber in other parts of the government, I think. So there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of development. DHS has actively gone in the right direction. One of the, I guess the last things I'd say in response to your question, Michael, human level coordination is absolutely important, getting the people together, working on things. In the long term, we are only going to succeed if people are less important, if we rely on machine-to-machine collaboration and response, which is why initiatives that folks like Phyllis kicked off, the automated indicator sharing program, that's the ability to say, here's a feed, you don't have to look, you don't have your SOC people look at it, here's stuff that you can take and operationalize is where we need to be. And I think that continuing growth and development in a place like DHS has been really positive.
And I would thank Phil and his teams and the team before you. I mean, we came into all the work that Phil and his team had done to then be able to build on top of that, and the people that are in now will build on top of all of that, and they'll take it forward. You know, one of the things that we focused a lot on, I'll give you 3 areas that had 3 vectors of our focus. One was really making sure we went from a system of vaccines to an immune system. So, you know, I spent 4 years explaining to anybody that would listen to me, including our legislators, that, and everybody got it, but it was, you need your measles vaccine, so we don't kill that off. But what programs like Einstein and other things did was brought intelligence about what was trying to attack in real time to the tune of millions of events a day across our US government, brought that back into our operations center so we could analyze it to what Phil just said, make sense of it, and push it out at machine speed so you have this network of building an electronic immune system. And many of you have heard me talk about that before, but that was a big deal for us. It helped us, if you recall, when the department released the list of Russian IP addresses on 30 December. Great time to be working in Washington, by the way, the commute was wonderful. But if you look at that list, we were able to know in just a few minutes what was new and what was not based on the work that we had built from just using that intelligence, what you'd seen before and what you hadn't. And I think the team will, I'm sure the teams are taking that forward. There are great people in these roles now, and being able to use technology, I think you'll see a lot of our problems in cyber come from the fact that computers are very fast and networks are even faster. So we can compute a lot of knowledge and we can send it anywhere, and unfortunately it's going to get received. And an adversary doesn't have to know anything to purchase a way to puncture that. So as we look at the other 2 pillars of where I think DHS really stepped up, the second pillar was led by the Secretary and on downward, having a real role in cyber. Secretary Johnson made it his business to learn and understand and care about cybersecurity. He would come up to the Ops Center and spend a day in there just talking to people, understanding their concerns. The first time I thought it was kind of funny because he wanted to do it incognito, but when you have 9 Secret Service people in the back, it's hard. But he did make a really big point of understanding it, asking about it, and then relating it to all the other functions of the department, whether it was ICE or Secret Service, and they have a huge role in cybersecurity, especially in the investigation of financial crimes, into FEMA, into counterterrorism, into all the other parts that made the department, the Coast Guard, huge in the maritime piece. So really, really stepping up. And third, enabling the team on the policy side with the credibility to be able to combine cyber operational knowledge with reaching into the combination into critical infrastructure and teaching people on the ground how to protect themselves and how to be ready. Because I can't say this just from everything I've seen in computers my whole life. You're going to get hacked, and it's not that prevention is not important, it's just not enough. The Klingon ships are coming, your force fields should be up. We get that. But what are you going to do when they get you? And that's the part that I think that we're lacking, this whole risk management piece. Sitting down and having, to Frank's point when you said finger pointing, but the really hard and ugly conversations with a board of directors or a head of an agency that says, are you encrypting data at rest, right? Is your stuff confidential so when Jupiter hacks Saturn and everything's exposed, it's not really exposed and you call it a day? and having a conversation with a board of directors that says, you may think cybersecurity is in the IT budget, but you know what, that got used up for the color printer last week, and we may want to think about how we put this into an overall discussion of risk. So I think the department has really, really stepped up and has a huge role, but it's going to take, again, better budgeting. I think PPD 41 is a really good start, but not enough people understand how to use it. And really what it did was it kind of divided the law enforcement role from the intelligence role from the ops role. I think that NKIC and DHS is really earning their stripes and their credibility as we speak. But overall, the trust between government and private sector isn't quite there yet, and I would make sure that we continue to inject private sector technology and thought into everything we do, because it moves a lot faster.
I guess a few threads that I would pull from what's been talked about so far is really leadership. I would say informed leadership, because that is a big deal. I suppose if you have access to the president, you'd like that to be the person that you really want to have access to the president, and to be carrying the message that's informed about exactly what the situation is and what the capabilities are and what actions are being taken. So that's a pretty important thing that I do give Secretary Johnson a lot of credit for trying to really understand that and embrace it. And there are a lot of leaders out there, certainly as you talk about in the private sector and the C-suite. It's a complicated area, and it really does have pretty significant repercussions if you don't understand it. So taking the time to do that is important in public and private sector. Say the capability points that Phil was making, workforce is a capability. So I would somewhat add that to the discussion of maybe it's covered under budget and authorities, because you would like to think you have the budget and the authorities and then therefore the ability to attract the talent, but we have that challenge everywhere. And I do think that the workforce itself is a significant limiting factor that does in some respects help frame who exactly is going to be the big player, certainly within the government, but also in the private sector. We're all competing for that same talented pool, limited pool of people. And then the automated information sharing. I mean, people are absolutely going to be the heart of this throughout, making the policy determinations, coming together and setting priorities and deciding what actions to take, but building that automated sharing capability and really taking the hardest, I guess the most labor-intensive part of the work and giving it to the systems that are capable of doing it. There's certainly been a lot of work at DHS to build that and to build credibility through having that and sharing things real time. That's certainly what we want to be continuing to support and do.
So those are all great points. I had kind of an aha moment last week when I was testifying in front of Congress, which I guess is not the greatest time to have an aha moment. But I was testifying about cyber workforce recruiting and retention for the House Homeland Security Subcommittee on Cyber and Infrastructure Protection. And as I was talking, we were talking about the need for more and more cyber professionals. And it all goes back, if you think about it, to link back to the legislation that was passed on information sharing allowed us to share information at a very tactical level, like through AIS, which allows us to not solve the problem by hiring 1.8 million cyber professionals. It allows us to get that automation down. And I thought about how, hey, I'm hoping that somebody else was really thinking about this in the background, and I'm just now figuring it out. But I had the luxury of being in a position where I can hire great cyber professionals who can communicate and share information with my peers and with government at both the tactical and strategic levels. Is that model going to continue to work? Is there something else that's a next big step that will help us at either at the policy level, at the academia, technology level? What's going to be the next big thing like that that'll push that forward?
I'll take first bite at this apple and don't pretend to have all the answers here, but it is both getting the entire American population and workforce cyber enough savvy, and then getting those that have the deep STEM, computer science, electronic engineering expertise, and bringing that into the fold. So you've got a dual challenge here. It's not just getting the cyber experts, but everyone's as vulnerable as the weakest link. And if you don't have your workforce, a majority of which are the ones being phished, and the tail and the trail begins with those individuals, I don't care how sophisticated your cyber capabilities are. So you've got a dual set of issues here. You really do have a K through 12 issue matched up with a STEM issue. Moreover, from an academic perspective, I honestly think, so I run an MBA with a focus on cybersecurity, and my curricula, it changes dramatically every couple of months, not year. I can't just dust off the old Soviet rule book and teach along those lines. The reality is it moves so quickly, so rapidly, and the truth is that it's not just a technology issue, it's not just a decision-making issue, it's the convergence of a whole host of different skills that are treated disparately right now. And I think that gets down to some of what we were discussing earlier. I mean, I don't want to suggest, there's been so much blood, sweat, and tears put into trying to get our heads around this problem, but when you really think about it, we have a lot of strategy at that 30,000-foot level. We got a ton of TTPs and tactics at that very pointy end of the spear level, but we kind of miss the doctrine that pulls strategy to tactics, and doctrine by definition has to constantly change based on lessons learned. So based on those tactics, you're then informing your strategy. I genuinely think that's kind of where we are. We're sort of at that, and I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing. There's no finger pointing here. It's just an experiential thing, and to me, that's kind of where we are. So I'll defer to others who are much smarter folks.
Anybody else? Next big thing, and what'll keep us forward a little bit?
Machine learning is big, though. I forgot to mention. Machine AI, I'm totally bought in on that. So, Phil's
So what he said. Yes, I was going to mention the AI piece. It was mentioned earlier, the speed of machines helps replace some of the people, but computer automation is not meant to replace people. It's meant to use your talents on the harder problems. So as computing gets faster, we're working very hard to figure out how you use that speed of computing, the very speed that the adversary is using to eat our lunch right now, how we use that speed to look at trends, to discover anomalies, to do things like cure diseases. And I think that's going to be being able to harness some of that for our work as well as other areas of infrastructure protection that will inform cyber, I think is going to be a next piece of that. But it's going to affect our culture as well, because we're going to have to educate folks on the new types of jobs that are available. So all of a sudden you have a lot of data from a computer that's designed to make your life simpler because you have the 8 out of 9 billion cases to look at. Now you have to be hyper-trained and more precise on what you pick, and you have to understand how these machines work. We're never going to get to a place where a machine is the human brain for a bunch of biological and I think philosophical reasons, but we are, I think, in the next decade and a half, embarking on a time when our entire world looks different. Now, between now and then, a key piece of making things like automation details. And while we do all that, I do want to put another push, though, that it's really all about your resilience. Has your board been through an exercise that says, what would you do if? So that you know, for example, and I go back to what we all experienced with OPM on the US government side, when do you report something? And it's not, you weren't there then, so it was a video. But when do you report something?
I was there, I was just on the Hill and watching it and engaging from that side, which I know they enjoyed.
It's hard.
But would that have triggered the sit room? You see,
Well,
these
but
are
that's
kind of
it.
interesting.
What triggers what?
You don't know?
There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of events on a single network every day. And 9 or 10 of them on a good day matter. And you have to be trained, and that's where some of the big compute comes in, trained to locate that. But once you do, yes, it means somebody tried and maybe even got into the network. At that point, is that a big event you put on the front page? Maybe not. What did they see? And does seeing mean exposure? And does exposure mean that somebody made a copy of it and sent it out to another planet? So having, and this is different, at least in the private sector, in every company. And then you get into the regulator side of it. What actually has to get reported? Or what gets reported to law enforcement? Or what gets reported to government? DHS is not a regulator for most things, I think, except chemical. But do you have to, if you're a financial institution, when do you report? So there's a whole complexity that Frank alluded to that we need to start working with from just the risk level that I think is actually more dangerous to not be prepared for in some ways than lacking some technology. And I think that's where we have to fix.
Anybody wants to line up for a question at one of the microphones while we're finishing this part of the debate, just go on up and get ready.
So just briefly, I'd like to bounce off what Frank said and then Phyllis expanded on, which is AI, or artificial intelligence. I had an interesting debate with a former administration official because he raised the point that it's not actually clear if AI is going to benefit attackers or defenders more, because attackers are going to use AI as well. And what I said at the time is, if AI doesn't benefit defenders more, then we're living in end times. We are facing apocalypse on the networks because if we can't find an advantage to defenders, then we are totally hosed. That's the scientific term. The only advantage defenders have is the size of the network. That's the only thing they've got. And while complexity is normally a disadvantage, if you sensorize that network, if you build out things like automated information indicator sharing, and enable self-defending networks, the size of the network and its capability to observe lots of things and make local distributed decisions benefits the good guys. That's the only thing that does. So that will be the game changer, or there will be no game changer.
Can I do one counter to it? So I agree mostly, but AI is not a product that you buy. AI is a capability given the materials, the energy consumption, and Moore's law that we're able to process, compute with, and it's the ability to do the right algorithms, the right hardware. So the capability of processing a bunch of numbers really fast is just as able to be acquired by an adversary as it is by us. So if we want it to benefit the defenders, we have to take the action, because the adversaries typically have a lot of money and they don't have any lawyers. And that's been part of our lag.
And can I just build on that? Because I think Phil finally touched on something we may have a little point of disagreement here. I think the initiative remains with the attacker, end of story. And that doesn't mean you give up. The attack surface will grow, it will grow exponentially, but unless you start empowering the private sector to be able to take more proactive steps, we're always going to be firewalling our way out of the problem, which by definition is inherently flawed. So to me, the AI question, even if it does benefit the attacker, is irrelevant. We still need to be able to come to tools to be able to defend and to at least identify our growing attack surface writ large. Because if our definition is to defend our way out of this problem, we lost. I mean, it's the cryptologist debate. We're never going to win that, and I don't think we have to win that. What I think we do need to be able to do is get to the point where we can put some pain on the bad guys and not blame the good guys. And by that, I mean, let's stop blaming the victim, let's stop blaming companies after they've been hit, and start putting pain on the adversary. And there are a lot of things that can be done there. We don't want cowboys shooting, don't get me wrong, and I'm not arguing for hacking back or anything along those lines, but I am arguing that there are a number of steps that can be taken. And to me, a deterrent discussion has to be had, and it's not about cyber. It's about deterring actors. It's about deterring Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, actor A, B, C, D, and E. So I'm glad you just brought it up, because it was finally something I disagreed with. Otherwise, I agree with everything.
No, well, we don't have time to drill into it, but I'm going to put together an RSA panel, Oxford-style debate that we can do, because this is, I think, a really fascinating topic.
I think
So if you guys want to go read a little background information on active defense, the stuff that Frank's talking about, go look up we're at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security Active Defense task force that we put together.
some smart people.
That Frank put together last year. Nice report that kind of solidifies the discussion about active defense and how you get ahead of the problem a little bit. We've only got a minute and 19 seconds left, but I really wanted to talk a little bit about sort of this move to the cloud, because you can't have a cyber panel without mentioning the word cloud. But I actually had one of the cloud vendors tell me, the CISO of Northrop Grumman, hey, most people are moving to the cloud now because it's more secure. I jumped up on my chair, what? And Kathy, maybe you talk a little bit about the financial aspects of that move to the cloud, and we could probably be here the rest of the afternoon talking about the pros and cons, but I think it plays into the roles and responsibilities a lot about who does what to whom when you're talking about cloud and the shifting boundary of responsibility.
And I will say, I will definitely pick that up, but from the last conversation, I generally had everything going through my head about how the government at all keeps up with any of this. And I mean, the workforce challenges, the budget challenges, the procurement, the lawyers, to Phyllis's point, I am a lawyer, but I like to think I'm a good one. I actually try to find a solution as opposed to raising problems. But it is a massive challenge that we are facing, whether it is going to cloud capabilities or even the discussions about shared services. So one thing that certainly we are going to continue to focus on is how to consolidate responsibilities, consolidate capabilities, take some of these things off of smaller entities that really don't need to be running them themselves. You know, we have the Department of Commerce came together many years ago, the Department of Transportation as well, the Department of Homeland Security, and they are in various iterations of realizing that each office doesn't need to have its own, you know, HR person, CIO, and everything else. So trying to figure out, frankly, that the other challenge though is you need to give them a solution to go to. And I can't say we have a lot of great shining examples across the government of a place that you could go to that could really be capable of meeting your needs and managing it. So we continue to work through that, but that is, I think the answer to cloud. I'm not getting into the technical side, that's not my realm anyway, but I do see some great opportunities. You know, the big data center initiative too. It was a huge benefit to the Department of Homeland Security to consolidate. I know Luke is here and his predecessors, there were a lot of people involved in trying to do that, and it was extremely painful. And I'll admit, you know, the savings maybe did not turn out the way everyone hoped it would, but just understanding what you have, and now the opportunity to move to the cloud and do other things with the appropriate systems. To Mike's point, that's not necessarily a more secure inherently to go to the cloud, but thinking about what should go and what shouldn't, and even knowing your universe. And so we are absolutely going to be continuing to push some of those things. And the other challenge, though, is it's not going to be everything. There's not going to be a big bang where we're going to take all government IT as an enterprise and somehow be able to pull all of that into, you know, one big super system here. But I think the opportunities are there to have the talent consolidated, have the capabilities consolidated, provide the services, and have some transparency about that. So we'll continue to push.
I just want to thank the panel. I know we're out of time.
I got one question.
Oh, do I? Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. The light's pretty bright. Go ahead.
Is this working? Yeah, hi. Hi there. My name is Derek Johnson. I'm a reporter with Federal Computer Week. You had mentioned that one of the programs that was really effective was the automated indicator sharing program, but that not enough people are using it. That is personally something that I have heard from others, whether talking to people on the Hill or within federal agencies. I was wondering if whoever was most able to kind of take this question, if you could talk a little bit about why is it that people are not using the AIS program, and kind of what needs to happen to boost participation in it.
So hi, I'll try to jump into that a bit. I think there are two reasons, and they're both easily fixable because it's a good program. It puts machine-to-machine communication about what the bad guys are trying to do, and it puts data together and builds you trends in real time, builds you a little bit of a self-healing network. The first is a technical reason, the easier one. It's hard to connect it, and they're working on fixing that. If I were to simplify why it's hard to connect it, when you put a CD in, the CD has to track. Like the laser has to find the groove in the CD or the data to start reading it. And sometimes it's a standard, not a specification, which means there's a way to write the data in sticks, the structured trusted information exchange, indicator exchange, in the actual language that it reads all this information in. And sometimes it's off by literally one place or 5 places, and the program that's set to try to read it isn't set right. I mean, that's a very rudimentary example, but there are some kinks to work out, and it's been, at least when I was there, and they may have been much improved since then. My experience with this is dated by a few months, but it was just a hard thing to set up. It wasn't as easy as we wanted it to be, and nothing ever is of that structure. And also, some of the vendors now are ready to have their appliances, just like TVs 20 years ago were sold cable ready, to have their appliances ready to read these languages. The transport protocol, TAXI, Trusted Automated Exchange of Indicator Information. I did not name this, TAXII, but they're ready to read these. And the more you can buy something that's ready to get on and you don't have to do all that work yourself, the more easy adoption you'll get, just like cable TV. So I think that is easily fixable. The other part is a little bit harder to understand because it's dependent on the folks receiving and sharing the information. There's a lack of clarity, I think, among the information consumers and sharers of what is, quote, should be distributed and what should not. It's all open source. Anyone that is sharing information should not share, obviously, anything private. There are backstops in place to try to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think there's concern about people putting indicators into a system that's going to share it all over the internet. My personal opinion, I speak for myself, not for the US government on everything. My personal opinion is that the more indicators we can get out there, the better, and if they're open source, they're open source. But I think there are people still that, and they may have very good reasons, want to keep some of those separate and not in the open, and or don't understand the program. So there's some education to be had as well. And it's certainly a good opinion. It's their opinion. They're entitled to. We have to get through that in a policy sense. I believe this program has a nice future. Whether the protocols stay the same, I don't know. I would envision easier, lighter weight protocols in the future, and perhaps a different way of getting it, more of a, I'll go pull it from a central place rather than we have to distribute it all over the network. If you think about it, if you cut your hand, your body has a nice way of getting the right materials to prevent infection to your finger as soon as possible. The network doesn't do that in this system. You have to count on the fact that the right indicator will be sent to the right machine in time to see an attack coming or to know about it. In a different kind of a model where you fetch data that's constantly updated, that time might be decreased. But the overall idea that I think Phil pioneered, but that Phil mentioned about putting all this data together in the real-time machine-to-machine sharing, I would recommend and hope that's here to stay. Does that answer your?
Well, we're going to have to make sure that does answer the last question. Thank you very much, Phyllis, for that. Thank you all for being here, and let's thank our panel for a tremendous laydown of cyber issues. You know, I heard convergence, resilience, even cyber doctrine. That's pretty good. And a risk framework. These are issues discussed beautifully by this panel. I really got the point when it had to do with putting pain on the bad guys. That was equally good. But it's clear that we have a panel of experts up here. I think you all benefited from that discussion. Thankfully, Bev Cooper's down here. She was paddling away. Signal Magazine will be more than happy to make sure they all understand what you put out today. And obviously, we've taped this. It'll be up on our YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your attention, and we will now break for the last panel. Let's once again give our panel a hand, and we thank them. And on their behalf, we will make a donation to the Hurricane Disaster Relief Fund. Thank you. As you have known each other, I'm so glad it's a small community. Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing it together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're absolutely there.
Thank you. Good
Student
stuff.
bus benefit.
Yeah, we should.
Your student bus benefits.
Let's do it. I like that in a constructive kind of way.
That would be an exciting debate.
Every little bit counts.
It's been fun. It's been a whirlwind.
I think about him a lot.
Good. Allison, we spoke earlier and everything was.
I think so. So listen, one of the things that, first of all, now that I know that you should absolutely this discussion around AI, should AI throws, you gotta, no, you know what? Yeah, let's follow up. Well, right together. You know, I'm coming down, you know, back and forth quite a bit, so I'll send you a note. Perfect. Okay. No, thanks a lot. We'll be there.
How are you? Nice to see you.
John, I think you can take like 7 or 8 minutes if you want to.
7 what?
I think you can take 7 or 8 minutes. After this.
I don't mind.
So should we go over to Billington and recruit?
Good afternoon and welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get moving. I know that time is of the essence, I'm sure. Let's welcome our final panel this afternoon. Our moderator today, this afternoon, will be Larry Clinton. We've got a great title for this session this afternoon. Our final theme of the day is International Cyber, and we'll discuss some of the things that have been going on there for the last for quite a while, probably. Larry will moderate the panel this afternoon. Just a little bit of bio information on him. He's the president of the Internet Security Alliance, and the acronym there is ISA. It's a multi-sector trade association that focuses on thought leadership, policy advocacy, and development of best practices for cybersecurity. Larry is an author. He's also a spokesman on cybersecurity, and he has a degree from Carnegie Mellon in certification in cybersecurity oversight. Let's welcome this panel this afternoon, and he'll introduce his members. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me quickly tell you how we're going to operate this. The topic is international cybersecurity, which is a lot to cover in 30 minutes. So what we're going to do, since we have a really diverse and excellent group of people, is allow each of the panelists to take 5 minutes to tell you what they think you ought to know about cybersecurity. And then we're going to go immediately to questions from the audience. Now, if you don't have any questions, I do have some, so we won't be too much delay. But we'd really like to make this as much an interaction between you and the panel as possible. So let me start by introducing the handsome gentleman in the middle, who is John Boyens. John is a senior advisor for security at NIST, which is obviously part of the Department of Commerce. He leads NIST's Information Communications and Supply Chain Risk Management Program. He's worked on various White House-led initiatives, including trusted identities, botnets, supply chains, and most recently, the Cybersecurity Executive Order and related work on the order, including my favorite, incentives, government acquisition policy, your favorite, and the framework and the roadmap. We also have with us from the academic world, Rebecca Lewis. Rebecca is the executive in residence and the director of the Kilgard Cybersecurity Governance Center at American University. Prior to joining AU, Rebecca practiced cybersecurity and information assurance law with the NSA and data privacy and public company representation as an associate with Latham & Watkins. We also have from Treasury, Holly Phelps. Holly is the Deputy Director for Cyber Information Group at the Department of Treasury. She is the Deputy Director for the Cyber Information Group in the Office of Infrastructure Protection at the Treasury. She previously held positions as Senior Sanctions Policy Advisor in Treasury's Office of Program Assets and the International Trade and Compliance Analyst for the Department of Commerce. She has a BA from Seton Hall and an MA from Johns Hopkins University. And finally, we have Jordana Siegel. Jordana, the redhead in the one over here. You can't miss her. Jordana is a veteran at the Department of Homeland Security, and she is currently the director for the International Cyber Policy Office in the Office of Policy at DHS. She's also worked at the National Security Council. She's a graduate from George Washington and has an undergraduate from University of California at San Diego. So if it's okay, Holly, I think we'll start with you and then move to the left with John. You can either speak from your chair or come up to the podium.
I'm going to sit in my chair if that's all right with folks. Thanks very much for having me, inviting me to join the panel today. The Department of the Treasury is quite focused on cybersecurity in the international sphere because the global financial system has no borders and everything is pretty interconnected. And that's really the point that I would like to drive home today, which is that in amidst everything else that has happened, we are reminded more and more about how much we depend on each other, how much we depend on our partners, our customers, our affiliates, foreign counterparts and their customers and affiliates, because speaking for the international financial system, it's about integrity, it's about trust. If you can't trust the transactions that are going through New York, you're going to have a really hard time building a business and generating economic growth. So my office was established after 9/11, the Office of Critical Infrastructure Protection and Compliance Policy at Treasury, and it was designed to accomplish a few things. It's designed to really develop baseline protections and support practices in the financial sector as to how to prepare for significant cyber incidents and respond to them. We do a lot of information sharing, both with the sector through the ISACs and with our interagency partners. We enhance response and recovery efforts. So whenever there is a cybersecurity incident, in fact, whenever there's any kind of all hazards incident, so we're very focused right now on the hurricanes in Texas and Florida, our office gets involved to make sure that the system is working, that the core processes of the U.S. financial system have what they need, the information to make sure that transactions continue to be processed. Internationally, we're having this conversation as well. We work through the G7 very closely with central banks and foreign finance ministries. We co-chair a task force at the G7 on cybersecurity and have been talking about creating a common language. In October of 2016, we came out with what's called the fundamental elements of cybersecurity, which is the beginning of a dialogue with G7 countries about how really to be forward-leaning about what's important with respect to cybersecurity, how we can create broader standards and practices so that our industries, our financial institutions that work across borders can feel secure that their practices are going to work wherever they're operating. And that's one of the reasons why we care so deeply about the NIST framework, which I think that John is going to speak about. And that's because it encourages us to speak a common language and create a common dialogue so that we can talk about the problems and be able to actually define them. That's really something that we're focused on, and it seems really basic. But every time we think about the interdependencies, cybersecurity doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Your cybersecurity is only as valuable and as strong as your customers and your affiliates. This was a big lesson from the SWIFT, the intrusions against the SWIFT system, which really made us think about the core of trust in our global financial system. And so we work very closely with our domestic interagency partners. We work very closely with our foreign partners to really understand those interdependencies and break them off into small pieces. The NIST framework is a really great place to start there, but we know that there's a great deal more work to do. Thank you.
Thanks, and very happy to be here, so thank you for that. So the topic today for me is one of my personal passions, because it kind of follows along at least my career over the last 15, 16 years. So I started out at the International Trade Administration back in late 90s, Worked for about 10 years on international standards, but more in the compliance. So we pushed back against a lot of countries who had different requirements that prevented U.S. products from going inside. So 10 years looking at it from an industry perspective, looking at the use of international standards and looking at the information technology sector from a global perspective. Then I spent the last 9 years at NIST working on guidance, particularly supply chain risk management guidance for the federal government agencies. So kind of looking at it as a user from that perspective, right? But also taking with me a lot of the lessons learned with my international trade hat. So, and a lot of this, I see kind of the paradigm between cybersecurity, trade, and standards, right? And where they all kind of fit in there. In the information technology space, I mean, there's the good things, right? As a user, what information technology and the globalization of that sector has done for the societies and economies and businesses throughout the world is incredible. It's made products much more innovative. It's made them much cheaper. I mean, but the downside is our dependency upon them, right? And a lot of that is the security that goes in them. So standards have helped the globalization and development of products and services throughout the world. But when you get into the aspects of security, that's where you start getting a little bit of a twist. So a lot of countries now, I think this is one of the sticky wickets that we're confronted with, right? So when countries try to develop unique requirements, we can always push back and argue with the WTO and the technical barriers to trade argument. But when you throw in cybersecurity, then we start talking national security issues. And part of the problems that I think US companies have been faced with are there are a lot of policies overseas that start intermingling real, often perceived, but real security issues with industrial policy. And I think that's where some of our challenges have been in dealing with some of these cybersecurity issues overseas. As a consumer and looking at, you know, the supply chain issues of a federal government agency consuming information technology, again, that flips on its head. So we start dealing with the complexity of products, right? The visibility in this global supply chain, the fact that a lot of this technology, we don't even understand how it's made, produced. These are some of the challenges. Yet at the same time, we don't want to draw a circle and say, we're only going to use US products. I mean, that's 40, 50 plus years ago. We just can't do that, nor should we. So the solution that I don't think is easy, but I think that what we're faced with more and more is using international standards again in the cybersecurity space and trying to create at least a baseline. So even in the area of supply chain, being able to have some sort of assurance using standardization and conformity assessment of those products and services. And this, although the framework has the cybersecurity framework has a couple of key aspects, I would say for me, I think the number one benefit of the cybersecurity framework is that common messaging, right? A lot of people use different standards, approach cybersecurity risk management differently, but the framework offers one common messaging that can be shared throughout the supply chain, throughout governments, and it creates a common understanding of how an organization is managing that risk. I think those are a couple of the solutions. I think the big challenge that remains is trying to differentiate between real security issues and industrial policy. And I see that as an ongoing challenge over the next few years.
Thank you very much. And really delighted to be here, and I'm very glad that some of you have decided to stick it out for the final panel. Yeah, I think all of you deserve a round of applause, because I think this, as John mentioned, this is a topic I think that's also really near and dear to my heart, and I was delighted that it was going to be on the agenda today, and also glad that there's some interest in the topic. I thought I would talk a little bit about DHS's international cybersecurity priorities. As you know, DHS is a very large department with a very broad mission, and I know that you've been hearing from some of my colleagues and former colleagues throughout the day today. But the cybersecurity mission specifically is carried out by a number of different components within the department, from the work of the National Protection and Programs Directorate and the Office of Cybersecurity Communications, to the Transportation Security Administration, to the Coast Guard, to the Secret Service, the Science and Technology Directorate, and the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, to name a few. Those are the key ones. And so collectively, we have come together to form sort of a view of how we think about international cyber engagement across the different unique mission areas that each of our components carries out. And we fundamentally believe that it is an element. International partnerships and international engagement are fundamentally an element of mission execution. It's part and parcel to the broader focus on partnership that we have from a DHS perspective with colleagues across the federal civilian government, state and local government, the private sector, civil society, and certainly international plays a big role in that. And we also see DHS's role as key to shaping the environment or the evolving ecosystem to support our overall cybersecurity mission, as well as the security, resiliency, and reliability of cyberspace. And we know that DHS's efforts and role must be considered in the context of our broader national security goals as well as our foreign policy objectives. And within that context, we've identified 5 international cybersecurity priorities which reflect the operational efforts of each unique mission area of the components that I mentioned. And I think you'll hear some commonalities with what both Holly and John already mentioned. And I wanted to share those with you. The first one is building, sustaining, and advancing operational relationships to prevent incidents, to mitigate incidents, and respond to cyber events that do occur. And I think that the last few months have demonstrated that cyber incidents typically have a global dimension, or often have a global dimension, and this is a key element for DHS and our mission and what we need to do to manage events that may occur. And a lot of the work that we do in this space has to do with building partnerships with the global community of computer security incident response teams, or CSIRTs, and our National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center and our national CSIRT has a key role in this, and the partnerships that we've developed from the NCIC's perspective are very valuable in helping to manage events that do occur. The second one is working with foreign partners as well as the public and private sectors to help manage systemic cyber risk and enhance the security and resiliency of U.S. critical infrastructure. And I think this builds exactly on what Holly and John were mentioning. And what we do internationally in that space is promoting partnership and a risk management model for collaboration with critical infrastructure owner and operators, and also promoting the use of the cybersecurity framework with foreign partners. There's great interest, I think, internationally for the way that the U.S. approaches this, and they just want to better understand how we're going about addressing some of these challenges. Combating cybercrime, the U.S. Secret Service, HSI, focus on partnering with law enforcement and foreign cyber centers, providing training on cybercrime investigations as well as digital forensics, and leading international law enforcement working groups in various fora internationally. We also focus quite a bit, and I'm sure you've heard about this earlier today as well, on strengthening information sharing to support cyber incident response efforts, including through automation, through some of the programs that we have focusing on automation, as well as to exchange expertise and best practices with our foreign counterparts. Information sharing is really bread and butter for DHS, and so this extends to how we partner with other countries as well to enhance our shared situational awareness about what's happening in the cyber ecosystem. And we also focus a lot on cyber due diligence and what programs and activities the department has underway to enhance cybersecurity, and how we can share what our lessons learned and how, you know, our approach is or isn't working with partners, and learn from them about how they're addressing some of the same issues and challenges. And then finally, this also incorporates some of the work that we do with regard to capacity building and helping nations build cybersecurity capacity in areas where we have expertise that we can share. And then finally, investing in research and development to identify new cybersecurity technologies in partnership with international technology innovators. And I think my colleague from our Science and Technology Director is speaking tomorrow, so I'm sure you'll hear more from him. And they have, you know, there's various, I think, DHS booths too, where you can learn more about these various activities and these mission priorities that we have. And the last thing I wanted to mention was how we focus on shaping the environment and what we are doing to promote cybersecurity in the global ecosystem. And this really requires DHS to contribute to laying the foundation for more defensible systems and infrastructure, for the establishment of norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace and promoting those norms, as well as coordinating approaches to common cybersecurity issues. And in this regard, we work very closely with other departments and agencies. I think Holly mentioned the G7. I think every single international fora has some sort of cybersecurity activity or working group, and often those are led by the State Department, but they rely on expertise from various departments and agencies to contribute to cybersecurity outputs. And DHS, based on our unique expertise, plays a role in many of those engagements to support U.S. goals and objectives. And we also focus on prioritizing R&D efforts to foster more fundamentally secure products and services to really enhance security fundamentally overall. So that's just a snapshot of sort of the broad DHS mission and what we are doing internationally on cybersecurity, and happy to talk more detail as we get into questions and answers.
Rebecca, thank you.
Try not to blast you guys away. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lewis. I am the director of the COGAD Cybersecurity Governance Center, which is housed within the business school at American University, just up the street here. I thought I would share just with you kind of what are some key issues that I think are most relevant and happening in the international space, but on a pretty basic level. And I wanted to start by telling you a couple anecdotes. So recently I went down to North Carolina, which is where I'm from, and spoke to some general counsels of a variety of companies. And in preparation for that panel, I was talking to someone and they said, well, but I mean, a lot of these GCs don't really need to worry about cybersecurity so much. I mean, Bojangles doesn't really care about cybersecurity. And I don't know, for those of you who are from the South, Bojangles is the big fast food restaurant down there that we all love. And so I said, well, let's pull up their 10K. So we looked at it, and of course, in their risk factors, they've got a variety of things about cybersecurity and data privacy and data breaches. And I said, you know, there was recently a shareholder derivative suit filed against Wendy's for, a breach that they had. And so what I want to talk to you about, kind of the first issue in international cybersecurity from a governance perspective, is still that there's a lot of awareness to be improved upon and to be increased. And that, in my experience here in the States, is consistent with my experiences abroad as well. Last December was speaking in Venice to a variety of small and medium-sized businesses from across Europe, and many of them have been thinking about these issues for a long time, but the event was on the digital economy, and a lot of them weren't really thinking about security. And I talked about the NIST framework, and many of them were very excited afterwards to hear about that. At the same event, there was a consultant from a consultancy firm in Europe, who spoke and kind of gave a walkthrough of what they're recommending as a framework for how to think about cybersecurity issues. And that's the second trend that I think is worth thinking about, is that there are just it's impossible to count the number of different frameworks and ways to think about cybersecurity. Every consulting firm in town and across the world is starting to come up with a plan. And it's really overwhelming. It's really difficult for organizations to think about which one fits them the best. Okay, I'm a small business, I'm a startup, I'm a large multinational. Which one of these do I even pick in the first place? So that's the next issue, is coming up with an actual strategy for how to deal with it. And so I would echo my panelists to say that at the center, we are very much in favor of the cybersecurity framework, in part because it's consistent in terms of the 5 core functions that it identifies that seems consistent with the areas of interest for organizations, but also because, as my co-panelists have said, it provides a common language, and there really is benefit to that, especially for people who are newcomers to the field or who don't really know how to address this. And for those of us who've been talking about cybersecurity for some time, that may seem a little kind of anticlimactic, but I think there really is a lot of value there. And the third piece is whether you have the NIST framework or something else is actually figuring out how to implement that. And that is also consistent. It's a problem that companies and governments everywhere are facing. It's not specific to the United States. We're actually pretty far ahead of a lot of countries. I was speaking with a lawyer down in Australia who was saying that they're really excited about the framework, the cybersecurity framework there, but they too are not really sure how to actually go about implementing it. So I think those 3 issues, kind of increase awareness, figuring out how to have a strategy and which strategy to use, and then how to actually implement it. And on the last one, I would say, so some of the work that we're doing at the Cybersecurity Governance Center is actually using academic research to figure out what are maybe cost-effective measures for implementing different pieces of the framework, but then being able to link those up and actually identify for people, okay, we're looking at, one thing I'm working on is how might you better protect privacy in the Internet of Things, but how might you do that in a cost-effective way, and then being able to point people to say, okay, if you decided to adopt the framework, then you are within, in this case, maybe you're under the detect function, and you're looking at anomalies and events, and working all the way down to say, okay, we're implementing this, how might we actually go about doing that? There are researchers in Israel who have been looking at how might a company, in a more cost-effective way, develop a baseline of what is normal operations for all of their devices and networks so that they can better spot abnormal operations. And one thing, I was just speaking with someone recently saying, well, if the manufacturers and producers of these devices would actually just publish when they produce the device to say this is the output that should be normal, so that companies don't have to start building that baseline themselves when they bring all of their connected devices in, that would be a huge cost savings. Maybe that needs to be mandatory. So those are kind of the 3 issues, and I'm really curious to hear what questions we might have from the audience.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to stand because I can't see the side of the room from my chair. So as I said, we'll immediately go to questions from you. We have about 7.5 minutes, so we don't have that much time. Questions? So, I think he's leaving. I don't think he has. Do you have a question?
No, yes, sir.
Oh, yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bob Wood with AFCEA. AFCEA is going to put together an event in January that has universities and cyber centers for excellence in terms of education. I'm curious, maybe Rebecca has the experience with the broad base of universities interested in providing the kind of education and training that is needed to build this workforce. Is that a community that's coalescing? Is that a community that's diverse, still looking for the kind of right framework to teach? How is it going in academia? Because we hear from our military stakeholders that say we get a lot of different questions and there's no central kind of collection of information, and so we're going to throw a conference in January down in Augusta to do that, but I hope I'm not barking up the wrong tree. It seems to me there's a lot of disparate understanding and they're all trying to do right, but they can't find the center line. How's it look from academia?
Yeah, I'll start there, but I think that some of my other panelists may have something to say as well, because they've got a view from the outside, if you will. And I should say I've been in academia for about a year. Before that, I was at NSA and then in the private sector. So I have developed gotten a crash course in what's happening in academia. But I would say, consistent with your remarks, there's a lot going on, but it's kind of a swirl right now. So. Of course, for us, so the Cybersecurity Governance Center, we launched in October of 2015. We're fairly new, but since that time, there's been a lot of interest and movement in MBA programs and other kind of not your typical technical side of things, which I view as it's a really fantastic thing. But I will tell you, my experience is that students are still, so I just taught a class last night. I teach cybersecurity governance. Students are concerned. Some of them are wondering, do I need to have a background in technical? Do I need to have an interest in technical to take this course? And then some of them, they just don't really know what it might be about if it's not about the technical or the legal piece. So there is a lot of interest, and I would say, just thinking anecdotally on my LinkedIn feed, I see all the time people asking practitioners to answer survey results because academics are really trying to gather information. One of the biggest struggles in academia is getting our hands on good data because companies are understandably concerned about sharing their data, even with scholars. So.
I would just add on to that I think another good place to perhaps, another good resource might be the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, which is run by, not to steal John's thunder, but DHS has a role in it too, run by NIST. And there's quite a bit of work underway across 4 different sort of strands of activity. And the President's executive order also had a tasking related to workforce development, and I'm hoping that that might be published before your January conference. And there was a significant effort undertaken by NIST and DHS, which led the implementation of that particular deliverable, to reach out to the stakeholder community and particularly academia and private sector and government as well, to bring in a number of different perspectives about how to enhance some of the work that we're doing in that space. And so I would just highlight those things as you know, some additional resources that might assist.
And agree on all. I would just add that we recently released a publication on workforce framework.
Your question, sir.
Hi, I'm Mark Emery. Thanks for everybody doing this today. I think it was mentioned early on in all your discussions was the issue with international partners is trust and setting up agreements and something like that. But I don't even know if this has something to do with it, but I was wondering, could you comment, is technologies like blockchain and how they're governed and internationally and the implementation of those technologies, will that help generate trust in the cyberspace and with financial transactions and other, international transactions for the government?
Sure. So blockchain is a really interesting, problem and opportunity for us to look at, both from creating economic opportunity and creating transparency, and also looking at it from a security standpoint. I think there are still a lot of conversations to be had about the role that blockchain can play in more formal financial system processes. We've seen some really good case studies from individual institutions, and where there's still a good bit for us to learn. I'm not able to comment on how it's going to come out from a regulation standpoint. But from my office, we're charged with helping the private sector identify opportunities for them to improve their cybersecurity posture. And to the extent that distributed ledger technology and other sorts of emerging technologies help them in that endeavor, we're always trying to promote that.
And I would say that blockchain, is the latest flavor of the month. It's often thrown around as a silver bullet in almost every circumstance. I don't think it is. For one, it actually tries to take that trust element out, which is fine. I would say that there's other technologies and other processes and procedures that build that verification and validation, which offer greater assurance. I don't think that you can just have plain blind trust, but at the same time, there's no technology or process or procedure that you can put in place if you actually don't have any trust.
So we just have one more minute left. I'd like to ask a question, and I'd like to build on something you said, Holly, and maybe you and Jordana can comment on this. One of the things that strikes people like myself is, for notwithstanding all the good work that's being done in the private sector and the public sector and academia, we're losing this race and losing it pretty badly. One of the comments you made, Holly, was part of the problem is we don't have any borders anymore. And what that made me think of is, how do we coordinate? How do we organize using facing a borderless problem when we're stuck in the borders, and whether or not we frankly need an entirely different system, thinking about this in an entirely different way rather than the traditional nation state, treaties, et cetera, which frankly seem to be moving much too slowly. So I'd be interested in yours and Jordana's views on that, and Rebecca and John, if you like. Go ahead.
Sure. So obviously where I sit at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, I'm focused on the U.S. financial system first and foremost. But it is really true that particularly when you're looking at financial data and financial flows, that what happens in another country has absolutely an impact on what happens in the United States. I think for us it comes down to super basic issues. And I'll go back to the NIST framework a little bit on this, because the first function in the NIST framework is to identify. If you don't know what you're protecting, we cannot hope to understand how to go about figuring out how to protect it. And so it's important for us in our core conversations to understand what it is that what do the networks look like? Where is the connectivity? Where are the exposures? Back to the SWIFT example, they really discovered that endpoint security of a terminal at the Bank of Bangladesh created a phenomenal vulnerability for the entirety of the system. And that turned on its head the idea that we can only focus on our own security. So at least from the Treasury standpoint, it's a much more holistic approach. You start at what is it that is in your control? What is it that's most important for you? And then let's build up from there. What do you have? How do you protect it? And then how are you making sure that you are not only increasing your own security, but the security of those that touch you? And that can happen with company to company in terms of legal mechanisms and contracts that they have. We have conversations with foreign partners all the time. It really relies on being able to speak the same language and everyone understanding precisely what the issue is that you're addressing. And sometimes that can seem like you're recreating the wheel every time, but if you don't have a common language, you can't possibly hope to reach a period where every party at the table agrees that they are securing and that they are protecting the same systems, the same processes. I don't know if that actually is true.
Do you have a thought on that, Jordana? Do we need a new system where treaties and
I would say
nation
that
states
that's a
work?
really intriguing question that we could probably spend an entire day or days talking about, because I think it is something that a big challenge that we are confronting as a community globally. I would not say, though, that we are stateless, if you will. I think that states still have responsibilities to uphold, but I do think that we have found from a U.S. government perspective that treaties, for example, or working through some sort of one ring to rule us all, if you will, doesn't really make sense, because treaties really only bind nation states. They don't include the private sector. And when we're talking about cybersecurity globally, it's really, again, a community effort that includes industry, civil society, as well as government. But we need some creative thinking here, because a lot of the paradigms that we do have and that we are using don't necessarily address all of the new challenges that are coming up on a daily basis, if you will. And so I guess that's a call to action, if you will, a challenge for us all to kind of think about how to move this forward as we continue working through many of the existing mechanisms that have added value in the conversation globally, and also think about new ways in which we can take this forward.
Appreciate it. We've gone over our time. I want you to join me in thanking the panel for a very, very interesting conversation.